everyone, and welcome back to The Career Catalyst, the podcast where we explore life behind the titles and dive into the stories, insights, and experiences of professionals shaping the world of healthcare and medicine. I'm your host, Maya.
And I'm your co-host, Ishal.
And since October is Mental Health Awareness Month, we've been dedicated our episodes to exploring different dimensions of mental and psychological well-being, from the emotional to the scientific aspects and everything in between.
Joining us today is Dr. Rylee Oram, a professor and educational consultant who holds PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Ottawa. Her research focuses on academic motivation, procrastination, and mental health among students, and she's dedicated her career to helping learners thrive both academically and emotionally. Whether you're curious about mental health, careers, or looking for ways to cope with stress, or just wondering what therapy actually looks like, this episode is for you. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Oram.
Thank you for having me, and such a nice introduction.
It's really great to have you. We're very excited to dive into this conversation, and I feel like a lot of students, including me, are going to relate to a lot of things that we're about to discuss. So let's get into it.
Amazing.
Okay, let's start by getting to know you a little more. Could you tell us about yourself and what you do?
Well, you guys already have my name and a little bit of my background, but my name is Rylee, and my pronouns are she, her, and I am a professor here at the University of Ottawa. I primarily teach social psychology-oriented courses, but I've also taught a lot of developmental style courses here, and I did my PhD here and was also an undergrad here as well, and I graduated in, I believe, 2021. It feels like a bit of a blur with the COVID mix, but March of 2021. And as you guys mentioned, my research primarily focused on academic motivation and procrastination, and really looking at how different learning environments may ultimately be fostering basic psychological needs, which is part of self-determination theory, which I can talk a little bit about as we dive into the research side of things, but ultimately focuses on how can we create learning environments that support the autonomy of students, so their sense of choice, their kind of sense of control in what they're learning. How can we foster competence, so ultimately, you know, how they feel about their skills and abilities of learning the material or applying the material, and then also how do we create a sense of community within our classrooms, because that is something that is really important when it comes to academic motivation and reducing procrastination. But I was also in an ADHD and development lab, so there has always been a little bit of a lens that I see a lot of those topics through ADHD. And as you guys mentioned, I'm an educational consultant and learning strategist at the Child, Adolescent, and Family Center of Ottawa, where I work with a lot of youth, so children and youth. So basically, I will work with people from like maybe 8 years old all the way till undergrad, exploring different ways to make learning work well for them. So if they're experiencing, let's say, neurodiversity, we try to explore different ways of tapping into, let's say, different executive functions, which we can also talk about today, and how that might influence their motivation and also reducing their procrastination. So I'm a little bit in the teaching side of things, in a more academic context, but also in the teaching side of things in a more clinical context. And I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about my journey, because I think it's really empowering for students to hear about, you know, a trajectory that isn't linear, and mine most certainly was not linear, because I did my PhD in experimental psychology, but I'm really ultimately working in a very clinical context. So I can kind of give a little bit of information around that as well in our conversation. Yeah. So that's kind of a little bit of a short synopsis.
That's great.
Yeah, it was really great to hear. I didn't even know that was an option, you know, teaching in the clinical context. But what exactly inspired you to pursue psychology, and what led you to focus on academic motivation and procrastination?
Well, I actually took a psychology course when I was in grade 11, and I think it was like psychology, maybe sociology, and like philosophy kind of lumped together in high school. And right away, I knew that there was a major interest in exploring psychology more. And when I was in high school, it was a very basic level of psychology. And I was like, you know what? I feel like this is something that's speaking to me more than anything else that I had as an option in university. And so I did my undergrad in psychology. I started off at Lakehead University, which is in Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is where I'm from originally. And within that particular program, I thought I was going to actually do a minor in English and a major in psychology. And then once I actually moved to the University of Ottawa for my third year, that is where I decided, okay, I'm going to just go fully into psychology because that's ultimately where I saw a lot of opportunity, and I was very passionate about helping people, which is the most cliche thing, I think, coming from folks who are in psychology, but it's very true. I think often a lot of people go into psychology because they're interested in learning more about how people think, why they act the way that they do, maybe even resolving like some of the challenges that they experience, but also really focusing on like, how can I ultimately contribute to somebody's mental health journey? And that is kind of what drove me to particularly come to psychology. The interest in academic motivation and procrastination came a little bit later on, to be honest. When I was in undergrad, the research that I actually conducted was related to depression and negative thinking patterns, and really looking at what are some of the intervention approaches to helping students, in particular undergraduate students who are experiencing depressive symptoms, because it's very difficult for a lot of students to be able to access that support. So we were kind of exploring a low cost and brief intervention. And to be honest, I think I didn't really go down the road of motivation until maybe first or second year in grad school. So I think a lot of people think that going into grad school and going into your PhD, you're laser focused, you know, you have an idea of research that you want to conduct. Often it takes a couple years to sort that out. You're kind of really needing to take the time to explore what's been done, really sink your teeth into the research, because ultimately you want to be able to contribute novelly to that particular area, right? So I actually got on the route of academic motivation through my exploration of self-determination theory, which is a meta theory of motivation. It's one of the most cited theories that looks at academic motivation and motivation as a whole. And once I saw that there was those three basic psychological needs that they were kind of positing led to academic motivation, I was like, oh my gosh, I relate to so much of this. And I thought back to my undergrad, and I was never like the A+ student in undergrad. I was always trying to balance working and friends and social life, and then also trying to do the best that I could in terms of my learning. And I realized that there were components of that were missing for me. And I thought, okay, this is like a good route to go down. And so that's where I kind of started getting into the motivational side of things, and then realizing ultimately that even though we know that there's a link between motivation and procrastination inherently, there wasn't actually a lot of exploration of like really what the learning environment contributes to that relationship, and really looking at how ultimately those three needs might play a significant role in that relationship, or might precipitate motivation and procrastination, or just in general might be related. So that was a gap in the research that I saw. And I was like, okay, this is perfect. Let's explore it. And so that's kind of what led me on the journey to looking at motivation and procrastination, partly because I experienced it, certainly as a student, but also really diving into the research and really relating to it myself in terms of like, okay, these are things that were missing for me. How can we ultimately integrate those into learning environments as educators?
Wow, that is really great.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such an interesting pathway, you know. It's also, like you said, it's kind of non-linear. Like you started with like depression and stuff, and then you switched into exploring motivation and procrastination, and also, like you said, how the learning environment impacts the student's motivation and, you know, their ability to actually stick to their work. And yeah, which I agree with you. As a student, I feel like it really has a lot to do with the person's motivation.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like the learning environment can play a considerable role in terms of making people feel more motivated. And we'll probably dive in a little bit more in some of those additional questions that you guys have about it. But yeah, there's a lot of different components, right? There's the more individual side of things, but there's also very much the environmental side of things that impacts us.
Yeah. Could you walk us, I think we already did that. You walked us through your academic and professional journey, and what were the key steps or turning points that led you to where you are now?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of gave you guys a little bit of an idea of like going through my undergrad and grad school and whatnot. But I think if I can add anything to that, I think it's thinking about whether to go, at least from a psychology perspective, thinking about where you want to go after undergrad. I think that's a big question for a lot of students. And even like people for like biomed, because I know there's a lot of biomed students that are interested in psychology and kind of like applying that in some context. And it was a challenging decision for sure to try to figure out, do I want to go a more clinical route or am I more interested in the research side of things? And what's nice about clinical is that you do get the research side of things kind of integrated. So the big question is really, are you someone that wants to be kind of front lines working with people directly and helping them in a more therapeutic context? Or are you someone that's really interested in potentially teaching or, doing statistics and kind of more behind the scenes, helping with the research side, right? And to be honest, I didn't really know where I wanted to go. I was a bit on the fence. My honors thesis supervisor was like, you should do clinical. I see you in clinical. I feel like that's where you will thrive. And to be honest, I didn't think that it was the right fit for me at the time. And it's crazy because we kind of have to make decisions when we're very young for the rest of our lives, right? When you guys think about high school, we have to make the decision when we're 17, what route we're going to spend 4 or 5 years pursuing. And then when you go into grad school and potentially a PhD, you also have to decide, am I willing to dedicate kind of my career to this particular path, which was at my life stage. I think I was 22 when I graduated. I was like not ready and prepared, but I had it in my head that I had to make a decision and kind of like continue the path, which also I want to say for folks, like take the time you need to explore options and not jump into decisions because you feel like there's a social pressure to do so, because it is so important to make sure that that's the route you want to go down. And I will say that for me, I always kind of was on both sides. Even in my experimental PhD, there were times when I was like, should I switch into clinical? Like, should I drop out and reapply to clinical? Like, is that the route that I should take? Because a part of me at the time was like, I'm not ready to be somebody's person, right? In terms of a therapeutic context. And so now I always say to students, make the decision based on the potential, right, of the things that you have interest in, because you don't need to necessarily feel that way in that exact moment. But if you can see yourself doing that and that's something that excites you, then go that direction. Because I kind of wish I gave myself a little bit more credit and actually took that risk of going into clinical. And that's not to negate the experience I had in experimental, because it was wonderful and it led me here. But I will say that, exploring those options is really important, kind of weighing them out. It is something that I think is going to just help with your motivation as you go through the program, because graduate school, med school, these are not easy things to go through. And if you don't have that intrinsic motivation to do it, then it's going to be that much more challenging. That's right, all that to say, loved experimental, loved that I got a bit of a mix because I was in a clinical lab. So I kind of got to have a little bit of that training, and that has allowed me now to work in a lot of different areas. I worked in the government while I was in grad school, working in program evaluation, which you guys are probably like, what is that? But it's essentially evaluating different programs. And I was working with like STEM folks. So looking at like the quality of programs at the National Research Council of Canada. So I was like telling physicists how to improve their research programs, which is wild. Again, never thought I would be there. Then moved into accommodations. So working in accommodations here at the University of Ottawa and Carleton University, because again, I really recognized I wanted to be more in a practical kind of application of my teaching and skills. And then now that's what has led me to working with youth kind of in a similar way, like really supporting their learning and different strategies. And then also getting the side of my experimental degree, which is the teaching component.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
I know. So I figured that was like some additional info that might be helpful.
100%. I think you gave us a lot of valuable life lessons just now. It was very nice to hear as a fourth year. And yeah, every field comes with lessons that shape us. What are some realizations or challenges that have influenced how you approach your work?
I have always been someone that which could be a blessing and a curse, that always says yes. I am always taking different opportunities, which has benefited me a lot in terms of what I do now. Like a lot of the things that I have done in my career so far have ultimately been because I took risks and I took opportunities that maybe at the time were a little bit, it was like a lot of work for sure. But it was very valuable. But I think the kind of other side of that is recognizing your boundaries and kind of those thresholds. Sometimes you do need to say no and value your energy and the amount of effort that something's going to take, because you don't want to be burnt out. And I know right now we're kind of in like a hustle culture of like doing everything that you can possibly do. And I think I've learned now, after kind of coming out of that for a good 5 years, of like, okay, now you have to be a bit selective of like where you give your energy. Because if it's not going to actively kind of contribute and align with your goals, then maybe it's not necessarily something that you want to actively pursue. There's kind of two sides, right? It's like take the opportunities, but also recognize when you need to kind of focus on yourself, because at the end of the day, like if you're not good, right, and you're not healthy, then all of these things aren't necessarily going to matter as much, right? And you're not going to be as efficient and as effective as you could be.
Yeah, you're right. To be honest, I agree with specifically that point, you know, if like you're not yourself, then what's the point, right?
Yeah.
So I really, really agree with that.
Yeah. And I think it's relevant too. And I don't know kind of what the demographic of the listeners is, but I think for a lot of biomed students, I hear that a lot of like just kind of burning the candle at both ends.
Yeah.
And a lot of expectations. And again, we'll talk maybe a little bit about grades and kind of how that impacts our motivation, but that can also contribute and kind of take away the enjoyment. And if you're not enjoying it and you're not really learning the same way, then again, like kind of what's it all for?
That's
yeah.
right. 100%. Totally. From your background in experimental psychology, what actually happens in our brains when we procrastinate or lose motivation? And are there psychological or neurological factors at play?
So there's a lot that happens in our brains for sure. And we can come at it from kind of multiple different areas, right, or different factors. I would say that ultimately, if we kind of think about our brains and we think about our particular behaviors, there's a lot of different parts of our brain that drive our behaviors, right? There could be more of that kind of basic level functioning that's coming from more kind of prehistoric areas of our brain versus our prefrontal cortex. That's ultimately that kind of more advanced part of our brain. And some of the work that I do really focuses on the prefrontal cortex and executive function. So I like to think of it as the prefrontal cortex is kind of like the hardware of the computer. You know, if we think of our brain as a computer, that's kind of like the component, but our executive functions is what's running on that computer. So it's the software of our brains. And ultimately, there can certainly be things like our amygdala, our emotions that play a significant role, but those emotions are also going to impact our executive functions, which are things like our attention, our concentration, our time management, our decision making, our flexible thinking, right? So all of those things are going to play a role in whether we are going to be motivated. So there's a lot of neurological components, absolutely, and we could go into like neural pathways and stuff like that, but I think that focusing on maybe those executive functions is really beneficial, because those are things that we can really train our brain to be better at. And yes, of course, we can kind of work with our emotions and really trying to recognize when maybe we are at a high level of stress, trying to reduce that level of stress, because ultimately there are parts of our brain that if we are super stressed, we go into fight or flight, and that kind of shuts down those executive functions, right? And so if we can kind of control that part of our brain, then we're able to better kind of activate and work on and train kind of that other component. So executive functions are a big part. Like, you know, there's our amygdala, there's our hypothalamus, like hunger, thirst, right? All of those things are going to play a significant role. And ultimately, we want to kind of work on all of those things in order to be able to be motivated and not to procrastinate. There's distractions, right? Things that take up mental space. That's also going to contribute. The reward system in our brain, that's another component. Neurotransmitters, how much dopamine are we getting from a certain experience? How much are we experiencing cortisol, right? Stress hormone. Those are things that will also influence us. And I will say that I think a lot of students will say they thrive on stress and cortisol, like gets them moving along. But at the end of the day, that's just arousal, right? When we have a higher level of arousal, that is going to kind of motivate us to engage in a particular action, but that might not be the action that actually benefits us, right? So again, that's where those executive functions can come in. And also emotion regulation. Also super key. So, there's a lot of different avenues I think we could go down in terms of what impacts motivation and procrastination. But for me, what I tend to really focus on is more of the executive function side of things, and also to some extent recognizing the emotions that play a role, because procrastination research has shown now more than ever how important emotions are. When it comes to motivating ourselves.
On the same subject, what do you think is maybe the most surprising thing you've discovered along the way?
Well, there's a lot of things I think that were surprising depending on the different way we look at the research. I think that it was both surprising and not surprising how prevalent procrastination is, of course. I knew that it was going to be fairly high for students, but when we looked at the statistics, it was around 88% of students said that they either procrastinated sometimes, often, or very often. And the other side of things was also how students don't really recognize exactly what procrastination is. And so when I was doing my research, there was a component of it that was more qualitative. We did an intervention where we asked students about their procrastination, and a lot of them initially underestimated their procrastination. So they would say sometimes, and then when we really dug into it, it was like, oh, okay, maybe I'm more of an often or very often. And there wasn't necessarily that connection between the emotions that were playing a role in that, as well as the element of like competence. I think that was a huge thing that I didn't necessarily realize would be so important. I recognize obviously the more confident and competent you are, the more motivated you're going to be. But I think I didn't really realize how much that was negatively impacting students, and how often students didn't feel confident in their skills, which was obviously kind of sad because I was like, oh my gosh, you guys should be so proud of yourselves for getting here. And there's obviously skills that you've demonstrated. So that was surprising. And I'd also say how important relatedness was in motivation, that people really want to feel connected to their community, to their school, but most importantly, their professors. So the more connected you feel, the more approachable your professor is, the more engaged they are, the more they're willing to answer questions. That was something that seemed to really impact someone's level of motivation in a course. And that was a big part of the discussions that we had, was like, what about this professor makes them someone that you feel more motivated to work for, or to kind of like put more effort in. And it was, I think, an important component of, again, kind of that idea of how do we adapt the learning environment so that it does foster some of that motivation. So it really kind of allowed me to think about, these are the things that students are having difficulties with within the learning environment, within themselves. What are we going to do about that? So was it like 100% surprising? Maybe not. Like a lot of research, to be honest, feels a little bit common sense, but we can't necessarily see that cause and effect relationship. But hearing about students' experiences and kind of how important some of those things were was enlightening, for sure. Yeah.
I agree with you when you mentioned that a lot of students don't think that they're actually like confident enough, and like this imposter syndrome that kind of everyone, has it on some level. And and a lot of things actually contribute to that, like you said, learning environment, what you're actually doing, and whether it's hard or not hard, and like your relationship with professors and things like that. So it all, is at play, and all contributes. Yeah.
And I just think, again, kind of coming at it from working with a lot of students in accommodations and hearing their stories, but also in my intervention, hearing students say something like, yeah, the first day of class, our professor said like 50% of us are going to fail. And immediately for me, I'm like, oh my gosh, like that is so demotivating for people, right? Because you're going into it you're kind of setting an expectation, okay, you guys are going to fail. And what we know is that when we set an expectation like that, it creates, one, a self-fulfilling prophecy, and two, it actually reduces the amount of effort that people are going to put in, right? It reduces their competence, which inevitably will impact their motivation, which is going to impact their procrastination and their overall performance. So yeah, it sometimes can be disheartening to hear some of the ways that professors communicate, but it's obviously not just the professor, it's other factors, right? That play a significant role as well.
I was actually going to ask a follow-up question about the same thing. Like, if you had to pinpoint maybe one thing, like, why do you think competence is so low in students today? I was thinking like comparisons, social media, but
there's
I
for sure. I
thoughts.
think social comparison is huge, right? Grades. So just the idea that grades are kind of like the most important piece of education kind of precipitates or like causes or facilitates a little bit more of that comparison. And it also creates an achievement orientation, right? Which there's mastery orientation, there's achievement orientation. And achievement orientation often means that if you're not accomplishing something, then ultimately that reflects your true ability. So if you fail, well, that means you can't do anything. You don't have that skill. Whereas with a mastery orientation, you're really focusing on how do I build that skill? If I don't do well, what can I do to change that, right? How can I build some of those skills? How can I learn the best that I can? And that's something we also talk about in social psych. Like we talk about attribution theory, what level of effort can I put in? And also, if I don't do as well on something, I can adapt that effort. That's within my control, but it's also unstable, so it can change. Whereas our ability is something that is stable and internal, but we don't want to necessarily say when we fail, okay, this is because of my ability, because then we're diminishing our ability, which leads us to consistently chip away at that level of confidence. So I think there's a lot of different factors that kind of contribute to that. And I also think just the different, I hate to bring it up, but the pandemic also kind of impacted students. We are seeing more now than ever in stats that students don't feel prepared to come to university. A lot of them feel overwhelmed within the first year. And of course, when you come and you're not necessarily taught those particular skills, then it increases the chances you're going to have those negative experiences, which again is going to continue that pattern. So there can be that social comparison, like you mentioned. I think the grade component, that achievement orientation, and then also, some students just not feeling as prepared coming in. And so it's kind of like, for me, at least as a researcher, it's okay, well, how then do we prepare students, right? What can schools do, but also what can parents do? What can siblings do? What can we put out there as resources for families to help prepare students coming to university? And how can we also set expectations? Because a lot of students come into university being like, okay, well, I got A+ in high school, I'm going to get A+ in university. And unfortunately, that doesn't often happen, especially in first year, because there is that transitional piece to coming to university. And so again, it's kind of setting the expectation, providing that education of like, look, it's okay and normal to have those ups and downs, especially in first year. It's more about, okay, well, how do we kind of bounce back from that? What can I learn from that experience? Because I'm not going to lie to you guys, first and second year grades don't matter that much. It's more about honestly focusing on the learning, because when you apply to grad school, they're focusing on those last couple years ultimately. So
yeah, that's right. Especially when students like fail or like not do something as well, and then they think that it kind of reflects back on them, which creates this like positive feedback mechanism, and then it keeps like going and going, keeps happening, and then it kind of like makes the student believe that, oh yeah, maybe I'm just like this,
Yep. And it's a real psychological phenomenon called learned helplessness, when basically we just believe at some point that nothing we do is going to change, right? The outcome. And so then that's when we get people who might, let's say, not study for an exam because they're like, what's the point? And if we think about like school and how school is kind of formatted, in North America and all over the world, a lot of it is really like school becomes a lot of students' identities, right? Like that's the main thing.
Yeah.
So you chip away at that, and all of a sudden it's like all the other components of who you are start to crumble away, right? And that's going to impact your confidence and competence in other situations. So we always want to be building up ourselves and our identity in a variety of different ways in different domains, because then that means if like we take away one piece, then we're still good, right? But we can't change the whole system, right? As much as I would love to completely change this whole institution, we can't necessarily do that. So part of it does come down to how we process some of those challenges.
Yeah, definitely. How does our brain chemistry influence motivation and focus? And are there practical ways students can work with their brains rather than against them?
Absolutely. So, I mean, brain chemistry, I can't speak too much to the specifics behind brain chemistry. You know, I could go into like neurotransmitters and stuff like that, right? Because if we obviously have those feel good neurotransmitters, then that's going to inevitably help us with motivation. Sometimes stress can also help with motivation because, again, like I mentioned, that's kind of the arousal piece. But I think in terms of what we can do in order to work with our brains is ultimately building self-awareness, right, of how our brain works. Like, do we know that we have difficulty concentrating for an hour? Okay, if we know that an hour is not realistic and we know, to be honest, after 15 minutes we start zoning out, then that is how we structure our study sessions, right? And we try to make sure then that maybe we are integrating some sort of stimulus or stimuli that helps us to maintain a little bit of that energy or that arousal. So for example, for some folks, it might be like drinking a fizzy drink, like a bubbly or something like that. Like that can be helpful. It provides a little bit of arousal. It helps with focus because it's kind of stimulating parts of your brain that are kind of tapping in a little bit. It can be building some strategies around time management, right? Being able to recognize when you work best. So for example, if you know you're a morning person, then we probably want to put the things that are more cognitively draining in the morning versus you doing it after a 7 to 10 class, right? Going to the library after 7 to 10. There's also all different types of ways of like practicing certain skills. So I think there's like even a website called like Brain HQ that has like different like little practice activities that kind of build our ability to focus in on certain details. It's basically supposed to be like executive function training games. And people can use those, but I would say that your day-to-day is honestly like the best training that you can use, because we are always juggling so many different things. And by building some of that self-awareness, you're able to put in different routines, different habits that are going to help you mitigate maybe some of the ways that you process information or some of the ways that you do go about your day. But for a lot of us, we don't really focus on that self-awareness. We actually just keep doing things because other people are doing them or other people have told us to do them a certain way. So people might go to the library and say to themselves, okay, I'm going to sit here and study for 8 hours because that's what all my friends do. But then we actually think about it and it's like they might have had like 2 hours of like good quality studying and maybe studying in the way their friends told them, like rewriting notes or rereading things, which we know is not particularly effective for helping us retain information. We really want to try to connect it with information we already know because that's already embedded. And so doing any sort of practice or examples, thinking about your own life and how that applies, that's going to allow you to build and move that information short-term into working and then into long-term storage, right? And really trying to like challenge yourself in certain ways. Flexible thinking is such a major skill to have, and it's something that we don't always all do very well, like being able to adapt and kind of come up with different strategies that again will work better for us. So trying those things can be really helpful, right? You might say to yourself, okay, you know, I have a hard time concentrating at this point, but you've never actually tried to do homework at that time. So it's like, who knows? Let's try maybe a simple task. Maybe it's answering emails at that particular time and using the time that you have. And going along with flexible thinking too, like a lot of students say, I need this amount of time to do something. And if they don't have that amount of time, then they don't do it. So now I challenge sometimes students to say, okay, well, let's do what you can do within that amount of time, right? Because that's, again, kind of flexing that muscle of being able to kind of pivot and adapt. That's just a small amount. I could go for hours, you guys.
Well, in your experience, in your time working with undergrads, what mental health challenges do you see most often, and how do they tie into academic performance? And then, based on that, what are some like realistic small changes that could make a difference in this context?
So while working in accommodations, the kind of most prevalent would be like depression or like mood disorders. Those were super common. So depression and anxiety were very, very common for people to come to accommodations with. But we're also seeing a massive spike in ADHD diagnoses. That's a big one. And also increases in learning disabilities. And all of those different diagnoses can be comorbid with one another and can kind of cause particular challenges, right? If you are someone that has dyslexia, there could be some additional stress and anxiety that comes with trying to manage ultimately an education system that isn't built for you. And so I think that's part of why we do see so much depression and anxiety, because there's all these other things that are also playing a role and are comorbid with those things. When it comes to small strategies, again, I think that building self-awareness is one of the most powerful things that we can do, like recognizing situations that might be stressful or triggering and really trying to catch ourselves before we start to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole or start to spiral, right? And try to challenge it actively. I think for folks, especially who are dealing with depression or anxiety, a lot of what therapists or clinicians will do is really actively trying to unlearn a lot of those cognitive distortions, right? Where people might be worrying about something where they don't really have a lot of evidence that supports that particular worry. I like to think of anxiety as like creating conspiracy theories about yourself where there's like no real evidence, but we keep reinforcing them consistently through what we would refer to as like safety behaviors. And with depression, it's again kind of, if we think about certain thoughts and neural pathways as muscles, you're continuously strengthening that by always kind of going to that particular path. So some of depression work and things like cognitive behavioral therapy and even dialectical behavioral therapy is really about trying to unlearn a lot of those thinking patterns or challenge them actively. So when you go into, let's say, seeing an exam mark and it's not the mark that you wanted, instead of, being self-deprecating and thinking about all the kind of negative things, it's really thinking, okay, you know what? This happened. Yeah. It sucks. It's not denying those emotions. Yeah. But it's also recognizing, okay, well, then what do I do to move forward? Like, how do I just put one foot in front of the other? Is it going to my prof and like talking to them about different strategies? Is it reflecting on how amazing of a friend I am? Because sometimes we got to take a little bit of confidence from those other areas. It's not comparing ourselves to other people because everybody is different, right? And you can think of it, I always think of it from a research kind of analogy of like, we can't control every variable. Right? And we can't control every variable with someone who isn't us. So how can we really make any sort of generalizable result from that? So really trying to figure out you, right? Figure out you and try to amp yourself up a little bit as best as you can. Catch yourself when you are kind of going into maybe negative thinking patterns, surrounding yourself with people who can support you and remind you of the skills and abilities you have, reflecting on other things that bring you joy, integrating enriching activities. Phones, binging, those are not enriching. I hate to like burst people's bubble, but they are not inherently self-care. There's parts of it that certainly can be, but when we're just shutting off our brain so we can avoid, that's not an active coping mechanism. So we really want to be doing things that recharge our battery, right? So like, what are things that bring you that intrinsic motivation or you're intrinsically motivated to do? If it's spending time with friends, amazing. If it's working out, amazing. If it's going for a walk, being around a dog. I don't know. I have 2 dogs. So I'm like, anytime I see a dog, I'm like, eat. Yeah. So it can be anything like that, right? Really trying to find something that brings you joy and can allow you to get from that point of maybe being super stressed to like taking it down a little bit of a notch so that you can kind of come at it with a little bit more level-headedness, a little bit more kind of rationality rather than leading with those those emotions.
Yeah, that's right. And it definitely, like you said, it definitely comes down to the individual's personal experience and all the factors, that are involved. And and it's just about figuring out what works best for each person based on their circumstances and, whatever works for them. Yeah.
Yeah. And obviously, if you can get mental health support, if you're managing some of that, highly recommend. And you don't even need to be spiraling or having a horrible time to seek out that support. It exists on campus. And I will be honest, they've gotten a lot better in the last few years around wait list times and stuff like that. They've really worked hard to try to implement a system that works well for students. And so think of it again like going to the gym. We go to the gym to be physically healthy. Well, what do we do for our brains? It can be an individual kind of exploration, but it can also be with the support of other people. And again, it could be you just go to the counseling sessions once a month just to get it all out there. Yeah.
That's a really good analogy. What you do for your brain, you work out for your body, but what do you do for your brain health?
Yeah, it's as important. They're all important in the same way.
Yeah. So it's almost like if you think about it, now I'm just going to go down this this analogy, but it's if we think of our physical health, right? We want to eat healthy and be nutritious. Often when we're going through maybe a depressive episode or feeling really horrible or, experiencing negative thoughts that might be more passive, but still, experiencing putting ourselves down or not feeling great. It's almost like we are just binge eating the worst things. We're not doing anything. We're letting our muscles atrophy. We don't want to necessarily do that, right? We want to be able to nourish ourselves. And that might mean, who knows, every single day thinking about what did I accomplish today that I can feel good about? And that can be making your bed. It can be getting out of bed. It could be brushing your teeth. That can be an accomplishment that we reflect on and integrate because that is going to help boost our mood and it's going to help with motivation as well.
Yeah, it's all about finding those little accomplishments and acknowledging them. Yeah. What are some of the biggest misconceptions students or people in general have about procrastination or motivation?
I think that it's that you have it or not in terms of motivation. Okay, motivation is kind of on a continuum. Everyone thinks that it's just I'm not motivated or I'm motivated.
Yeah.
We basically always have motivation, to be honest, because we're always doing stuff. To be honest, no motivation would be us basically doing absolutely nothing, right? Completely standing still. I think the other side is some people think of procrastination as a trait. It's not a trait. It is, for some people, more of a behavior. Researchers now really do focus on it as being a behavior. And also, I think the idea that when we procrastinate, we're lazy. For me, sometimes when I think about procrastination, it's a symptom of something. Something else is happening, right? It's not inherently about you being a bad person. It's not about you being lazy. It is a result of maybe an emotional experience or something else going on, other kind of cues or situations or contexts that are influencing you. So with motivation, I think that it's really recognizing that it's going to wax and wane, and we need to be able to find the things that kind of kickstart it to some extent, right? The things that will spark a little bit of that. And with procrastination, it's recognizing that it isn't stable. People think, again, if it's a trait, we can't fix it. It's who we are. We are a procrastinator, right? We identify with that. But ultimately, again, it's a behavior that we can actively change. And will I say that people can become zero procrastinators? I mean, there's probably people out there that can. Am I one? No, I certainly do. But I will say now I'm able to recognize it a lot more and also think of the different strategies that I can integrate to kind of help boost it. And sometimes it can be something so simple. It can be literally let me open this tab up or let me open this email and I will try to type a couple words. And so it can be that small that can really show okay, we've moved a little bit along that motivation continuum. It's not just one or the other.
Yeah.
And I think when we go in that black or white thinking, it makes it very easy for us to automatically kind of say, well, if I'm not motivated, I can't do anything.
Yeah. It's really on a spectrum. It's not black or white. And the fact that a lot of people kind of identify with it. It's almost an identity. Oh, I'm such a procrastinator.
Yeah. And we also know too, we talk about in social psych, I'm going to do a little bit of social psych review, is like group polarization, right? Or groupthink. So like with group polarization, if you're around a bunch of your friends and they're all like, oh my God, like I procrastinate so much, then that might amplify that perception, right, for you and everybody else. And that's going to influence your behaviors.
Yeah.
So that's another component of it. You know, when we all identify like that, then that becomes something stable and internal and more difficult for us to change sometimes. Yeah.
And also, speaking of procrastination, what's your take on the approach of dopamine loading?
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry, I actually haven't heard of what's dopamine loading.
It's like when like you don't start your day with like an activity that's really
Stimulating?
exactly
Okay,
and like
okay,
gives you
okay.
like high levels of dopamine, and then you
Yeah.
crash for
like,
the rest of the day.
Like, don't check your phone in the morning type thing. Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So it's funny that we mentioned like dopamine in general because when I work with some kids, we actually do an activity that's called dopamine menu, which is basically finding things that help kind of kickstart like some of our energy or our motivation to do certain things. That said, I think it depends on what the activity is. Okay. So if we're talking like that quick shot of like Instagram or TikTok or like social media, to be honest, would we probably be better off without that hit? Yes. But if we're talking about dopamine of like doing exercise or meditation or journaling or something like that as being an activity that gives you that, then I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think that's actually a really good thing to start your day that way. Yeah. But I think it really depends on what the task is. So and I don't want to just go off on like an anti-screen rant, but I will say that that is something that is deeply impacting our attention, our focus, our executive functions, our level of distraction and ability to engage with our world, with our experience. And I think if we're starting our day with something like that, which again is that kind of like real quick shot, then kind of a lot of the other things that we might be doing during our day is not going to feel as fulfilling.
Yeah.
Right? So we want to distinguish between things that are enriching, truly enriching activities and might be providing that kind of, we could think of it almost as like a natural source of dopamine versus like an artificial dose of dopamine. Maybe that's a way we can think about it.
That is a good way to put it. So in your work, what's been the most rewarding part? Like research, teaching, mentoring students?
I might give you guys another corny response for this one, but I will say growth of my clients, of my students.
Yeah.
It is so rewarding to see people recognize their progress, honestly. And we just talked about altruism in my class, and now I'm like thinking about that of like, is this altruistic? But it's like seeing someone open a gift, right? And it's like, oh, like I just love it. Like I sometimes want to give people gifts like early so I could just watch them. Like I'll be like, I bought you a gift. Can I give it to you like 2 weeks early? That's how it feels sometimes to see people really be able to recognize their potential, to see progress, to see them achieve their goals is so incredible. And I am very grateful that I've been a part of people's journeys, but I always remind them that like I might be a part of it, but there's no way that I in any way have caused, right, or have like made that happen. It's always been their own motivation and discipline and perseverance that has allowed them to do that. And I have seen some pretty incredible journeys, and I don't even think about this that often. Like I'm thinking about right now, I almost want to cry because I don't think about that very often. Because to be honest, when you're in the weeds and you're just in it, you're just going through the day to day. And to be honest, sometimes you get a little jaded. You're like, do people care about this? Is this worth, every piece that you're putting in? But then when you get to really reflect on it, like that's the best part for sure.
Yeah, that's really nice.
Yeah, that's so lovely.
That's really,
it's a bit corny, but like that really that is it. Yeah.
And you know what, like not me, because I'm not one of the students you mentor, but as a student in one of your classes, like the way that you structure your class and make yourself so available to questions, give us examples, and like it's so clear that you're trying to engage us with the information. It's like, it's really sweet that it feels like you want us to succeed. And it's really nice.
I think you shouldn't be an educator if you don't feel that way. And again, I can kind of go down a rabbit hole of that. But I think I did research, right, that talked about all of these things. And to me, it would be hypocritical to not integrate those. And as I was going through university, all I wanted was a professor that kind of, I felt like, heard me as a person, as a student, didn't just see me, as a student number, but was like, this is a person that is going to eventually go and do things. So as much as the research is great, I love doing research. It's super rewarding. And I say this when I even talk about research, like qualitative research is like my passion, because you get to engage with people. You get to learn about their backgrounds. They're not just a number that you're calculating in SPSS or R, right? You get to really hear about somebody's experience. That I think is the most rewarding part of it. 100%.
That's so lovely. That's amazing. Yeah, and like especially when you see like the actual effects of what you do, like you're like, I'm making a difference, and it's helping other people, and it's really, really nice to see that difference on people and how it's making a change for them,
and sometimes
amazing.
It's just reflecting back what they already have. It has nothing to do with me. I'm just like, here's a mirror, you're amazing, like how do we really allow you to internalize that?
And watching them grow and all of that, it's definitely really, really fulfilling. If you could go back to the start of your career journey, what advice would you give to your younger self?
That's a great question. I think I've partly kind of mentioned this, but I think it is giving yourself time and space to explore, what you're interested in. Don't feel pressured to go in a certain direction or at a certain timeline, because that's another one. We have it in our minds, undergrad, 4 years, then you go do a master's, or you go into law school, or you go into med school, or you go into your PhD, right? And I know not all of us have the opportunity to do that exploration. I totally get that. It's a privilege to be able to do that. But I will say that that's something that can be very helpful, that in hindsight, I think it would have been nice for me to take a breather and really explore what I was passionate about. And I think I would have ended up maybe in a bit of a different role, or maybe not. Maybe I would have been exactly where I am. We can think of it that way. And also just making decisions, again, really not thinking about what you can't do, but what you think you can do. Like, and it doesn't necessarily mean in that moment. Like, it doesn't necessarily mean you have those skills already, but like, can you develop those skills? So it's like very much about like self-efficacy. Make decisions based off self-efficacy. Try to build your self-efficacy so that you are making decisions based on that, because I know it's very daunting for a lot of people to take risks. And even if it doesn't work out, that's okay. It's just another learning experience. And I don't even like the word failure. I tell my clients that it's an opportunity for learning, and they laugh at me and they're like, okay, sure, lady. But that's ultimately what I try to focus on now. So like, taking those L's in stride, learning from them, exploring your options, and ultimately, I think really believing in yourself and making decisions based on that belief in yourself is incredibly important, because otherwise we rob ourselves of those opportunities.
That's right. Yeah, it's all really important. I do agree with you. And as you said, taking it in instead of thinking it's just like an item on a to-do list to check off. Yeah, which is really important. Yeah,
and just in general for students, like I didn't even go into my grade rant fully, but really when you guys, I know grades matter. I'm not going to lie and be in delulu and say to you guys grades don't matter, but really focus on like the learning component, because the whole reason why you guys are here is, yes, maybe to reach a particular goal, which I get. If you're going to med school, grades matter. Okay. But at the end of the day, if you're really learning, engaging, doing the best that you can to learn and apply that material, the grades are going to come. Like, it's not the grades first, right? It's the learning first. And when we focus on the learning, it just creates more space for that more intrinsic motivation, that growth, right? Whereas when we look at grades, that's more extrinsic, which is not as effective of a motivator, and also not very long-term. So that's another thing that we found from our research, is that those more kind of long-term value-based goals are what is actually going to propel us forward versus those more kind of short-term goals.
Yeah, because they're from the outside and it's not always available.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just really trying to reflect on that from time to time. Like, what is the value? What is the reason for why we're doing all of this? Because that's the main part.
Yeah.
Like, if I just focused on making money, right, then I'm not going to feel the same way that I do about what I do. But I focus on, like we talked about, right, like the clients and what I enjoy in the interaction really changes when you're having a bad day. You can be like, okay, this is the reason, this is why I'm doing this. Yeah.
So before we wrap up, if you could leave our listeners with one thought or one message, what would it be?
Oh my gosh, you guys, I feel like I have to come up with so many different
know,
good messages. I'm like,
gave us a good
what is the good message? I think, again, I just, the most important piece is really believing in yourself. Again, I'm going to a lot of corny routes today, but like, it really is like, even when things don't feel like they're going well, like truly reflect on like, what does that show? Like, what is your grit? What is your perseverance? Like, how, like your determination, reflecting on those traits, because I guarantee every single student has experienced a really challenging time and they've come out of it. And so it's reflecting on like, okay, I can do this. Like, I can overcome, maybe not doing as well on an exam, or balancing, 5 different exams. Someone had 4 exams in one day in my class, which is bonkers. And I was like, you should go to administration for that. Like, that's not, that's not healthy, and also should not happen. But like, they overcame that. I'm like, how much more stressful, could it get? Like, you did it. It may not have even been your best day or your best exams, but you did it. You like demonstrated that you showed up, you can commit to something. So I think really reflecting on those strengths, because like I said, competence is so important for motivation. When we don't feel like we have the skills or the abilities to do something, we're not going to want to do it. We're going to want to avoid it. But the more confident we feel, the more we're like, okay, you know what? I can tackle it. And I want to say, like, self-efficacy is all about like, how do I foster these skills? Like, can I foster these skills? And everybody can build these skills. You guys made it this far. You're in university. That's already an accomplishment. Yeah. Even though we like to think it's not that much of an accomplishment nowadays, it really still is. Like, not everybody could go through and do what you guys are doing. I mean, like I said, biomed, like I literally can't fathom it. So taking that on and being able to reflect on that is important.
This has been such an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for all of the valuable information that you gave us, and for sharing your experience and expertise with us. I think every student listening can definitely take something away from this, something valuable, whether it's understanding their own motivation better or realizing that mental health and academic success really go hand in hand.
We truly appreciate the work you do in helping students like learn, grow, build healthier relationships with their learning. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into the Career Catalyst. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to follow us on our socials, which you'll find in the description, for more stories and events featuring different professions around healthcare and medicine.
Until next time, keep learning and growing, stay curious and inspired, and let each story bring you closer to finding your own place in healthcare.